Unafraid. Chapter 6. Mary carried her jar down the hill to the well and took her place in line to wait. She listened, only half interested, as the women talked about a new prophet at the Jordan River. There was always someone claiming to be a prophet of God. "My son went down and heard him," one woman was saying. "He came back last night and told us this man speaks the words of Isaiah with power." "Do you think he's the Messiah?" another asked. "Who but God knows? My husband left this morning to hear John preach. He took our sons with him." At the mention of the man's name, Mary's heart leapt. She leaned forward. "Did you say his name was John?" "He's called John the Baptist." Containing her excitement, Mary filled her jar and lifted it to her head and plodded her way up the hill. She sloshed water as she set the jar down and hurried through the house to the shop where Jesus was working. "I just heard there's a prophet named John preaching at the Jordan River," she told him. "We must go and find out if this is Elizabeth's son." Jesus continued filing a yoke. "I heard." He knew? Why had he said nothing to her? She came closer. "We should go right away. I'll go at once and tell James and Joseph to make ready. They must come with us, and Simon and Jude, of course, and your sisters and their husbands. They should all come with us." Jesus raised his head and looked at her briefly, then returned his attention to the yoke he was smoothing. Mary frowned. "Isn't this God's sign we've been waiting for? John's appearance?" "Everything in God's time, Mother." Over the next few weeks, Mary strove for patience, but it seemed everyone in Nazareth except those of her family had gone down to hear John. The women at the well talked constantly about the Baptist. "There are multitudes gathering at the river. I heard that some Pharisees went to hear him, and he called them a brood of snakes. Even the tax gatherers and Roman soldiers are going down to hear him. My son thinks John is the Christ." The hair on the back of Mary's neck prickled. "Everyone is wondering about him," another said. Mary had to bite her tongue to keep from crying out in frustration that her son, Jesus, was the Christ, the Messiah. Each day added to her distress. Finally, she could bear it no longer. "I'm going to go, Jesus," she announced. "I want to see John." She was disheartened when he didn't offer to accompany her. The banks of the Jordan were teeming with men, women, and children when Mary and her younger sons arrived. The crowd was excited. Some called out questions to the wild-haired man who was sitting on a flat rock and was dressed in a garment of camel's hair and a leather belt about his waist. Was this unkempt man Elizabeth's son? It seemed everyone had come to hear this voice crying out in the wilderness, for there were gathered by the river prostitutes and priests, Roman soldiers and Hebrew scribes, farmers and fishermen. "Prove by the way you live that you have really turned from your sins and turned to God," John shouted, pointing at several Pharisees who stood near the water. "Don't just say, 'We're safe, we're the descendants of Abraham.' That proves nothing. God can change these stones here into children of Abraham." Even from a distance, Mary could see how his words were received. The Pharisees' heads reared up, and they turned their backs, stalking away. John shouted after them, "Even now the axe of God's judgment is poised, ready to sever your roots. Yes, every tree that does not produce good fruit will be chopped down and thrown into the fire." "Mama," Jude pointed, "there's Jesus." Mary spotted him among the throng near the river, where men and women around him were crying out for John to baptize them. Her heart beat faster as her son came closer to the prophet. "I baptize you with water for repentance," John said, lowering a man beneath the waters and raising him. As the man got his footing and stepped away, John looked straight at Jesus standing on the bank. He stared at him and fell silent as Jesus walked into the water and came face to face with the one who had recognized him from the womb. Mary took Simon's and Jude's hands and pressed through the crowd to get closer. John and Jesus talked briefly, and then John took hold of Jesus and lowered him beneath the waters, raising him up again. John looked up sharply as though something in the sky had caught his attention. Mary looked up, but saw nothing unusual. John stepped back and spread his hands as he stared at Jesus again, his expression rapt. Her son turned and waded out of the river and walked up to the bank as several young men splashed their way into the water to get close to John. "Come, my sons, we will do as your brother has done." Mary led her sons down to the river to be baptized, searching the crowd for a glimpse of Jesus. She thought she saw him once, but decided it couldn't be him because he was going off towards the east. When Mary and her younger sons arrived home in time to begin the Sabbath, Jesus was not there, nor did he return. A week passed, then another, and another, and Jesus did not come home. Where could he have gone? Had he been attacked on the way home and left bleeding beside the road? Surely not. But what else could have happened to him? James and Joseph were concerned and went off to seek word of him, returning a week later, unsatisfied and distressed. "No one has seen him, Mother." "Jesus will come home when he's ready," Mary said, instilling more confidence in her words than she felt. Wherever Jesus was, she knew God was watching over him and keeping him safe from harm. She was not afraid for him until she heard rumors that John the Baptist had been taken into custody by order of King Herod. Had her son gone to Jerusalem to argue for John's release? "Where is your good son, Mary?" the women asked at the well. "My husband came by the shop yesterday to have his plow repaired and only found Simon and Jude there." When Mary told them he'd gone down to the Jordan to be baptized, they shook their heads. "But that was weeks ago. It's not right that he leave you and the boys to fend for yourselves." Even her sons objected to the way Jesus had gone off and left them without a word. "He must do what his father tells him." "Our father is dead, Mother, and Jesus is the head of the household." Simon and Jude have read the Torah, and they've been apprenticed to Jesus in the shop long enough to carry on in their brother's absence. Even as she said the words, it occurred to her that Jesus might not come back at all. He was the Messiah. Why would he return to live in an obscure village in the district of Galilee? Maybe he's gone to Jerusalem. If not Jerusalem, where? What sort of son would leave a mother to worry like this? She must not worry. She must trust in God. The least he could have done is tell you where he was going and when he'd return. If he's so good, why would he turn his back on you and walk away without a word? Should she make demands of Jesus? He'd never given her cause to worry before. He'd never done anything without reason and prayer. He's your son. He owes you something for the suffering you've endured. He is God's son and owes me nothing. Mary covered her face and wept. Never had she felt so alone, even now with James and Joseph sitting on each side of her, Simon and Jude at her feet, her daughters close by. She hadn't felt such loneliness since Joseph died. Jesus had been her consolation, her strength. It wasn't happening the way she'd expected. Let him come and watch how I crush him. No, the promise is being fulfilled. Mary raised her head. The Lord is with us, and Jesus will make all things right. Mother? Mother, James said, putting his arm around her. She shook his arm off and stood. The Lord is with us, and you will see the day come when the Messiah crushes Satan beneath his heel. She saw her sons exchange looks of concern. Sorrow filled her. It would take more than her word to make them believe. It would take a change of heart. The day before Mary left to attend a relative's wedding in Cana, Jude came racing up the hill into the house. Jesus is coming! He's coming home! She ran down the hill to embrace him, weeping in joy. As soon as she put her arms around him, she was alarmed. "You're so thin," she said in dismay, "and dark." She touched his sunburned face, seeing the signs of healing heat blisters. "Come, you must eat and rest." Laughing, Jesus lifted her and kissed her cheeks as he set her on her feet again. "Woman, why are you always trying to tell me what to do?" Mary laughed with him and cupped his bronzed cheeks. "Is it not like a mother to mother her son?" It was only then she noticed a group of men watching the exchange. "Who are these men?" "They are my friends, Mother." She peered around Jesus and recognized two of them. "James! John! How is my brother Zebedee?" She went quickly to greet them. "He is well, Mary," John said, embracing her, "but annoyed that we've left his household to follow Jesus." She looked at the others and thought them a motley group. "Come, I have bread enough for all, and tomorrow we are invited to a wedding feast in Cana, and your friends are welcome to attend with us." Simon and Jude were vying for Jesus' attention as they walked up the hill together. She spent the evening joyfully serving her son and his friends. James and Joseph had come and drawn Jesus outside to talk with him earlier. She knew they were taking their older brother to task for worrying the family, and knew anything she might say would only add fuel to their fire. Still, she stood in the doorway, hoping her presence would still their critical tongues. Her presence did not ease their tension, but she was thankful Jesus listened as they listed their complaints. She had worried. She had slept fitfully. "I must go where the Spirit leads," Jesus said when they allowed him to speak. James's face was taut with frustration. "And what about Mother?" Jesus put a hand upon James's shoulder and smiled tenderly. "I have not left our mother without provision." Mary understood as clearly as James and Joseph that it was their time to help provide for her, that the full responsibility would no longer be on Jesus' shoulders. They left, annoyed when Jesus would not explain his absence or make promises regarding the future. She saw all too clearly the selfishness motivating their demands on him. Without their older brother to tend to everything, their lives would be less tidy, less convenient, less self-centered. She also saw their niggling jealousy of Jesus as the one who had captured and held her love. Perhaps she did favor Jesus over her other children, but how could she not when he was a perfect son and the others caused her endless trials and often, albeit unintentionally, hurt her feelings? She loved every one of her children, for they were her own flesh and blood. Would they never understand that Jesus was more than a child of her flesh? Would they continue to live in stubborn resistance? How was it these strangers who had come home with Jesus saw him more clearly than his own brothers did? And what a diverse band of men they were, mixed in age, occupation, education, and district. Simon Peter, a fisherman with a graying beard, was near her own age, while Andrew, his younger brother, looked more like a scribe than a laborer. Nathanael, tight-lipped, listened to every word Jesus said without making comment, while Philip asked question after question about various points of the law. Still, unlike James, Joseph, Anne, Sarah, Simon, and Jude, these men hung on Jesus' every word, and hope spilled from their eyes. As the sun set, Mary lit the lamps and went to bed content, for Jesus was home, and all would be well now. Mary, Jesus, and his friends walked together to Cana the next morning. She longed to have Jesus to herself again, even if for just a few minutes. But he seemed intent upon encouraging these disciples to learn what he wanted to teach them. Perhaps later she could talk with him alone. She ran her hand down his arm, pleased that the tunic she had woven during his absence looked so fine on him. The work had kept her hands and mind occupied during the long, dark days she hadn't known where he was. They arrived in time to join the procession through the small village as the bride was carried to her husband's household. The entire village was in attendance, and the food and wine given freely to all. The music of harp, lyre, flute, and drum kept many dancing far into the night. Mary had never seen so many at a wedding feast. Though the food was replenished from time to time, the wine flowed less freely as the celebration stretched into 2, then 3 days. On the 4th day, she overheard whispers of discontent. Jacob, the bridegroom, was so smitten with his new wife that he didn't even notice the look of growing strain on the servant's face as they tried to see to the needs of his guests. One tried to gain the steward's attention, but failed. Mary approached the servant. "What troubles you? We have these pitchers of wine left, and then we have no more. Perhaps Jacob has a store of wine in his house." The servant shook his head. If the groom ran out of wine before the wedding celebration was over, he would be shamed before his guests. Poor Jacob would never outlive such embarrassment. "Come, I'll speak to my son. He can help you." Jesus was deep in conversation with his friends when she approached. She entered the circle and knelt before her son, speaking softly. "They have no more wine." "How does that concern you and me?" Jesus asked, not unkindly. "My time has not yet come." She tilted her head and looked into his eyes with pleading. He knew as well as she that the lack of wine would pour humiliation on the groom's head and diminish his reputation before the community. She knew Jesus would not ignore the plight of this young relative, especially when he had brought friends with him to join in the celebration and increase the strain upon Jacob's supplies. Smiling, she took his hand and kissed his palm. Then she stepped outside the circle of her son's disciples, and spoke to the nervous servants waiting. "Do whatever he tells you." Then she stood aside to wait upon Jesus' decision. Remaining seated, Jesus looked at 6 large stone water pots set against the wall. They stood empty now, but would be filled for the custom of purification. "Fill the jars with water." Perplexed, the servants looked at one another. Mary could imagine them wondering what good that would do, for even the drunkest guests would know the difference between water and wine. However, they were so desperate, they hastened to obey. They raced back and forth between the communal well and the big stone pots while Jesus returned his attention to his disciples. When the jars had finally been filled to the brim, the perspiring servants came quickly to Jesus. "Dip some out," Jesus said, "and take it to the master of ceremonies." Mary followed the servant, who dipped a pitcher into the water and carried it to the master of ceremonies. The water poured red into the man's cup, and she felt a wave of exultation. When he sipped it, his eyes brightened. She was close enough to hear him speak to the groom. "Usually a host serves the best wine first. Then when everyone is full and doesn't care, he brings out the less expensive wines. But you have kept the best until now." Laughing joyously, Mary looked back at her son and saw astonishment on the faces of his disciples. Excited, the servants moved quickly among the guests, serving the new wine and spreading the news of what Jesus had done. And Mary watched it all, tears of joy running down her cheeks. Now they would believe. All the rumors that had surrounded her and Joseph would finally be laid to rest, and her sons and daughters and friends would know the truth. Jesus was the one her people had cried out for over the centuries. Jesus, the one who will save his people, Emmanuel, God with us. Soon Israel would be free. They all returned together from Nazareth and went to the synagogue to worship the Lord. Jesus sat near the front, his disciples around him. Mary, throat tight with excitement, strained forward to watch from the women's gallery as the Torah was read, and the men began to talk about the meaning of the law of Moses. When Jesus rose, there was a hush, for many had already heard he had been preaching along the shores of the Sea of Galilee, and it was rumored that he had turned water into wine at a wedding in Cana. The old rabbi held out his hand in invitation to Jesus. Jesus drew his prayer shawl over his head and stepped up to the platform. The rabbi handed him the scroll. Jesus unrolled it and began to read. "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he has appointed me to preach good news to the poor." Mary's heart leapt. She remembered Joseph's words when, together, they used to marvel at Jesus' reading of the Torah. His voice, Joseph would say, tears in his eyes, his voice is like no other when he reads the law. It doesn't pass over his tongue by years of practice, but comes out through his heart. Now their beloved Jesus was proclaiming to all that he was the Anointed One, the long-awaited Messiah. Mary looked down at her other sons, sitting in the row Jesus had left. To her dismay, she saw their shoulders droop and their heads go down. He has sent me to proclaim that captives will be released, that the blind will see, that the downtrodden will be freed from their oppressors, and that the time of the Lord's favor has come. Jesus closed the scroll and gave it back to the attendant. Then Jesus stepped down from the platform and took his seat again. The silence was deafening, every pair of eyes fixed upon him. Mary's heart was pounding faster and faster. Jesus spoke with quiet authority into the pulsating silence around him. This scripture has come true today before your very eyes. A man came to his feet. These scriptures are about the Messiah. He blasphemes. Mary saw the one her son called Peter jump to his feet. His face flushed. If you ask what he means, perhaps he was drowned out by the rising voices. I hear he's performed miracles, water into wine, tells stories about seeds and sparrows, has great wisdom. Where does he get his wisdom and his miracles? A man in the shadows mocked. He's just a carpenter's son. What makes him so great? Mary felt her face heat up, for she could feel the glances of the women around her, and the mocking words roused in the minds of the Nazarenes the foul rumors about her and Joseph, and how Jesus was conceived. No, she said softly. No, no. We know Mary, his mother, someone joined in, and his brothers, James, Joseph, Simon, and Jude. Her sons, mortified, were pointed out. All his sisters live right here among us, another called out. Mary glanced back and saw Sarah blush and cover her face, and Anne withdraw until she was near the doorway leading down and out of the synagogue. No, no, no. Mary shook her head, feeling eyes of pity and condemnation upon her. She turned away, only to hear a woman whisper, "And I always thought Jesus was such a nice boy, so good to his mother. She'll never live down the shame of this day." Jesus remained seated. A prophet is honored everywhere except in his own hometown. Now he's calling himself a prophet, a man shouted angrily. Jesus looked down the row at his cringing brothers, and among his own family, he added. He stood and faced his accusers. Certainly there were many widows in Israel who needed help in Elijah's time, when there was no rain for 3.5 years and hunger stalked the land. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of them. He was sent instead to a widow of Zarephath, a foreigner in the land of Sidon. Or think of the prophet Elisha, who healed Naaman, a Syrian, rather than the many lepers in Israel who needed help. Who does he think he is, speaking to us like this? He's a blasphemer! Stone him! No! Mary screamed, seeing men laying hands upon her son, seeing the disciples enter the fray. She pressed through and raced downstairs. Let him go! Let my son go! The men below rose and pulled and shoved Jesus and his disciples from the synagogue. She tried to reach him as the mob propelled him up and up towards the brow of the hill on which the town had been built. No, she cried out. You don't know what you're doing. A man shoved her back so that she fell to her knees, scraping her hands on the rocky ground. Gasping in pain, she scrambled to her feet and hurried after the crowd. Suddenly everyone stopped, and a strange hush fell over the mob. As Jesus walked back through their midst, each moved back from him as though being pushed back by unseen hands. Panting, tears streaming down her cheeks, Mary ran to him and fell into step beside him, his disciples following. Open their eyes, Jesus. Make them see. I know you can. Make them understand who you are. He stopped at the edge of town, on the road leading down the hill towards the Sea of Galilee, and looked at her. They've hardened their hearts, Mother. Then soften them, please, Jesus, for me. Never had she seen such sorrow in his eyes. He reached out and tenderly cupped her cheek. Mother, he said gently, Nazareth is no longer my home. Confused, she searched his eyes. But, Jesus, how can you say that? I'm here, your brothers and sisters. Jesus drew her into his arms and held her tightly. She inhaled the scent of her son and put her arms around him as she had done so many times in the past. But now something was different. She felt engulfed by his love, upheld in it, and yet felt him withdrawing from her. She held on tighter, but he took her hands from behind him and stepped back. He spoke in a still, small voice. Each must choose. He searched her face for a moment and then turned from her. As Jesus walked down the road, only his disciples followed. Mary gathered her sons and daughters. Your brother has left Nazareth, and he won't be coming back. Even if Jesus wanted to come back, I doubt he'd be allowed back inside the synagogue. James was downcast. Mary grasped James's hand and looked at the others. He took the road down to the Sea of Galilee. I think he's going back to Capernaum. We should go there. It might be a good idea to leave Nazareth for a few days, Joseph said solemnly, and let things settle down again. And we could talk to Jesus, James said. My husband needs me, Mother, Anne said. I can't go without his permission. Sarah looked as aggrieved as her sister. After what happened at the synagogue, how do any of us dare go? Mary was stunned by their faithlessness. Have you ever known your brother to lie? No, Mother. James's eyes darkened. But then he never claimed to be God before. He is the Son of God. She saw how her children stared at her. She told them again how the angel of the Lord had come to her. She told them how she had conceived by the Holy Spirit. She told them how the angel of the Lord had appeared to their father in a dream, telling him that Jesus was conceived by the Holy Spirit, and how he had married her and kept her a virgin until after Jesus was born in Bethlehem. She told them about the star over Bethlehem, the visit of the Magi, King Herod's decree to kill the children. When she finished, she looked from face to face and drew in a sobbing breath. Why won't you believe me? James leaned forward, clasping his hands tightly between his knees, his face haggard with concern. We know how children are conceived, Mother. He's our brother, and we love him. You think I'm lying. They preferred the lies of gossip to the truths she spoke. We think, he looked at the others, then back into her eyes, that you're deluded. Anger and hurt rose in her. Deluded? How? By whom? Your father Joseph? Other than Jesus, have you ever known such a righteous man so eager to please God? And Jesus, hasn't he always done what is right and true and noble? James hung his head. Just because he's obeyed the law doesn't mean he's God. She stood. She was angry, but she was even more afraid for them. What would become of her children if they rejected the Messiah? We will go to Capernaum. Your brother will make things clear to you. James and Joseph rose early one morning to speak with Jesus, but they were told Jesus had already gone off on one of his habitual solitary walks. The men he calls his disciples refused to tell us, his brothers, where he went. They act like bodyguards, they complained. Mary had hoped that her sons and daughters would recognize Jesus' true identity when they heard him preaching. But instead, they were even more confused by Jesus' parables about wheat and weeds and choice pearls and mustard seeds. They were offended when Jesus did not separate himself from the others and treat them with more consideration than the hodgepodge band hanging around him day and night. There was never time to be alone with him because so many were pleading for his attention. Furthermore, They were frightened by the approach of priests and dismayed when Jesus welcomed everyone. He even ate with prostitutes and tax collectors. Mary's daughters and sons-in-law left after 2 days, taking Simon and Jude back home with them. James and Joseph stayed another day and then urged Mary to come home with them. He doesn't need you, Mother. He's got a dozen men following him around like lost sheep. She felt torn between Jesus and her other sons and was finally swayed by their arguments. Passover was fast approaching, and she must prepare for the yearly pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Surely Jesus would join them for the journey to the city of David. It wasn't until the family came down from Nazareth that they heard from others that Jesus had gone on ahead without them. Your son is in the city already, Abijah told Mary when she arrived in Jerusalem with her family. He's been teaching in the corridors of the temple. The elderly man wore a frown. Everyone has been talking about him, his wife Rachel said. He seems to have a following. Abijah shook his head. The Pharisees are not pleased with his teachings. The Nazarenes weren't either, Joseph said grimly. I've heard that his disciples transgressed the tradition of the elders. How? Mary said. They did none of the ceremonial washing of hands before eating. It was on that very matter that the Pharisees questioned Jesus, and he called them hypocrites. The hair rose on the back of her neck. Hypocrites? She said weakly, unable to imagine Jesus losing his temper. My friend said he told them straight to their faces that they honored God with their lips, but not with their hearts. Your son said they worship in vain because they're teaching the doctrines and precepts of men. Abijah's face grew more and more flushed as he spoke. Of course, the unwashed mob that follows him loved it. He glowered at Mary. Where did your son get these ideas? You should speak to your son and remind him of the respect due the men who take our sacrifices before God. Your son. Your son. Mary could hear the accusation in her relative's voice. She felt the heat come into her face. Surely there was some mistake. Jesus had never been disrespectful to anyone. If he keeps on like this, he'll offend King Herod and end up like John the Baptist. Abijah, Rachel said in a hushed voice. Mary felt her blood go cold. What do you mean, end up like John? What happened? She looked round at the faces of her sons and other relatives. What were they keeping from her? James? Joseph? A muscle tensed in James's cheek. He was beheaded. Mary put her hand to her throat. Beheaded? Tears sprang to her eyes. John, the miracle child of Zachariah and Elizabeth, was dead? John, the child who recognized Jesus from the womb, was dead? It was only a matter of time, Abijah said. He offended Herod and Herodias. You can't shout that the king and his wife are adulterers without expecting repercussions. He said it wasn't lawful for Herod to have Herodias because her husband is Herod's brother Philip and still alive. She stared at him. But that's true. Everyone knows it's true. His face reddened. Of course it's true, but it's foolish to proclaim it. King Herod had John arrested. I think he merely intended to keep John away from the people for a while. But Herodias had a feast for the king's birthday. Herod was drunk when Herodias' daughter danced for him, and he promised her anything up to half his kingdom. And you can guess what happened. Herodias closed the trap and told the girl to ask for John's head on a silver platter. Mary shook her head slowly. No, no, how can this be? Abijah seemed distressed at her reaction to his news and turned to her sons in accusations. How is it your mother has not heard any of this? We didn't want to worry her, Joseph said. John was arrested during the time Jesus was missing. Missing? Abijah looked between her two oldest. When was this? After he went down to the Jordan and was baptized, James said. Mary clutched her hands in her lap, struggling against the emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. Her sons must think she was weak and could not bear to hear what was happening around her. What else were they withholding from her? John was a prophet of God, she insisted. Some say so, Abijah said sardonically. She lifted her chin and looked at the men of her family. A prophet of God speaks only the truth. James frowned. And every prophet who has done so has died for it. Abijah leaned forward. Your brother is going to get himself killed if he persists in offending everyone. Mary's eyes glistened. God brought Jesus out of my womb and made him trust in the Lord even at my breast. From conception, Jesus was cast upon the Lord. He can only do what God tells him to do. Abijah and Rachel stared at her, open-mouthed. Abijah looked at James. Is she claiming what I think she is? She believes it, James said, glancing at her and bowing his head in shame. Woman, Abijah said in pity, you are out of your mind if you think your son, the boy who has come every year to Jerusalem and sat at my table, is the Messiah. He rose and moved away from her as though she were contaminated. Mary felt Rachel's hand on her back. Mary, Mary, my dear friend, you are a good woman, but do you really believe yourself worthy to be chosen to bear God's anointed? A poor woman from Nazareth, whose husband was a humble carpenter? Our father was from the line of David, Jude said, pride pricked. So are a lot of other men, in higher stations than your father, Abijah said, and raised his hands. We are not speaking against our relatives. He was a good man, devout and faithful. But to be the father of the Messiah? Jesus is not Joseph's son. Mother, James said harshly, his eyes black with anger. Everyone in this room knows what really happened. Mary felt the blood surge into her cheeks. She looked around at them all. God will keep Jesus safe. Jesus will not die. He was the Messiah. He was the anointed one of God, the promised one who would save Israel. The Lord's hand is upon him. But she saw in their eyes that they didn't believe her, and, consequently, would not believe in Jesus either. Mary returned home to Nazareth despondent. The tension in the family had increased over the Passover week. Their relatives had pressured her and her sons again and again to speak to Jesus before harm came to him. Mary had the distinct feeling that Abijah was less concerned with the welfare of her son than with the shame Jesus might bring upon his household. When James and Joseph told her Jesus was back in Capernaum, she was not surprised that they wanted to go down and talk with him. She knew they feared for his life, but even more, they feared being excluded from the synagogue. The rabbi had been furious after Jesus' visit and said openly that anyone who believed Jesus was the Messiah would be cast from the congregation, just as the carpenter's son had been. We will go, she said firmly. We will go and talk with Jesus, and then you will see. But when she and her sons arrived in Capernaum, there was such a crowd around Peter's house that they couldn't even get close to the door. James shouldered his way through the crowd. Make way for us. This is Jesus' mother, and we are his brothers. Hearing that, people touched them and exclaimed how blessed they were. Still, they were allowed no closer than the doorway. From there, they could hear Jesus, but not see him. Farther than that, they could not move. James told the man in front of him to send word forward that Jesus' mother and brothers had come to speak with him. A few minutes later, Mary heard a voice call out, Your mother and your brothers are outside, and they want to speak with you. Who is my mother? She heard Jesus say. Who are my brothers? These are my mother and my brothers. Anyone who does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother. Mary felt the heat surge into her cheeks as those around her glanced at her and her sons, then looked quickly away. Your son no longer needs you, and now he rejects you. My son loves me. He loves his brothers. He would not reject us. He would not. James's face was red and angry, Joseph's pale, Simon's and Jude's confused and hurt. James leaned close to her ear. You see how it is now, Mother. Now that Jesus has a following, he doesn't care for his own flesh and blood. We will wait for him. Why? Joseph said. To be further humiliated? James put his arm around her as if to shield her from the curious glances of the crowd. We are leaving, he whispered harshly. If she argued with her children, she would cause further disruption. She went with them a ways, and then she put her foot down firmly. Are you all so proud you think Jesus must stop what he's doing the minute we appear? She did not say again that Jesus was about God's work, for that would only incense them more. We came because we love him, and look how he treats us, Simon said, tears running down his cheeks. We came because we didn't want him to end up like John with his head on a platter. Mary embraced her youngest sons and looked up at James and Joseph. Wait for him. Wait. Did you come all this way to turn your back on him? He turned his back on us first. James turned away, but not before she saw the sheen of tears glistening in his eyes. She refused to be swayed by hurt or confusion. She knew Jesus better than they did. Had she not been the one to suckle him at her breast and watch him grow into a man? Even as she walked away from them, she tried to turn them back. Remember the parables your brother told us when he came home to Nazareth the last time. He's teaching the people about the kingdom of heaven. He's defining the children of God. He does not think as we think, my sons. His ways are not like ordinary men's. His ways are higher. As she spoke her faith, assurance came, bringing comfort with it. He is not excluding us, my sons, but including all those who have come to him to hear what pleases God. She looked back at those who craned their necks to hear her son's words of hope, those who realize they need God, the gentle and lowly, the sick, those who mourn, those who are hungry and thirsty for justice. She put her hand on James's arm, stopping him. You know him, James, Joseph, Simon, Jude. You know him. Can you really say in your heart that Jesus has no love for you? They wouldn't listen. She yearned to stay behind in Capernaum, but knew that if she did, these sons of Joseph would feel she had rejected them, just as they were convinced Jesus was rejecting them. So, with sinking heart, she walked home with them. Every step away from Jesus made her feel more alone. Each must choose. The words echoed in her mind and made her heart ache. Jesus knew she loved him. Jesus knew she believed he was the Messiah. Jesus would understand that she couldn't leave her other sons. Each must choose. She had to stay with them and make them understand. Each must choose. If she left her other children, they would be hurt and angry, believing she had always favored Jesus over them. Each must choose. The farther she got from Capernaum and Jesus, the softer the echo of her son's words to her, and the deeper the ache in her heart. Her sister Mary and Clopas stopped by Mary's house on their way out of Nazareth. We've talked about it for months and decided to close our house and shut down our business so we can go with your son. Mary's eyes spilled over with tears. At last, her sister and her husband believed. She had thought the day would never come. Wait, she said, and hurried to the box that held the last of the gifts from the Magi. Mary put the incense and remaining pieces of gold into a bag and gave them to her sister. For Jesus to use. Why don't you come with us? I must try to sway my sons and daughters. Soon after, Mary went once again with her sons and daughters to Jerusalem for Passover. She sat among her disbelieving relatives, overhearing rumors that King Herod was looking for Jesus because he thought he was John the Baptist come back to life. There was growing antagonism in high places against her son. Wisely, Jesus had crossed the lake to Gennesaret and was preaching in the surrounding district. Upon her return to Nazareth, she heard that Jesus had departed from the district of Galilee and gone into the region of Judah beyond the Jordan. She heard the rumors that Jesus had gone to Sidon and Tyre. But why would her son be among the Gentiles? It was Israel that awaited the Messiah. With each day that passed, she felt the distance widen between her and Jesus, and the hearts of her sons growing harder. I want to go to him, Mary said, weeping. I want to see my son. All her efforts to save these stubborn children had failed. She was powerless to change their minds and hearts, powerless to turn them to the truth she knew, that Jesus was the Christ, the Son of the living God. O Lord God of Israel, God of mercy, why are they so stubborn? I can do nothing with them. O Lord, I'm placing them in your mighty hands. Be merciful. Please be merciful. You've tried to see him in Capernaum, Mother, her sons argued with her. Do you not remember what happened? He has thousands of followers crying out his name. He has his inner circle of friends. He's famous throughout Judea. He doesn't care about us anymore. It did no good to say Jesus loved them. It did no good to remind them of the years he had provided for them, held them in his lap, read to them, laughed with them, taught them. What would Jesus have to do to prove his love for them? A year passed, and another, and Mary knew the time was fast approaching when she would have to do what Jesus said. She would have to choose. And she knew she must make the same choice she had made 33 years ago. She must say yes to God and stop counting the cost, even if it meant giving up her children.